All right, let's read God's word together. It's from Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. But if you look at the church bulletin, we have verse 1, verse 2, 5, and 12. So we're going to read these 4 verses. So let's all rise and let's read it together. I'll read verse 1. You guys can read verse 2 and so forth. Okay. Genesis chapter 22, verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there, and we will worship, and then we will come back to you." Let's read it all together. "Do not lay on hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." This is God's word. Thanks be to God. Okay, let's greet one another before you sit down. Good to see you. Welcome to Miracleland. Let's be God's miracle. And God bless you. Okay, good. All right, we've been going over the entire Bible from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Now, we come to Genesis chapter 22. Now, this word that's recorded in Genesis chapter 22 is one of the most important tests that God has ever done to a human being. And it is one of the most important and most difficult tests that any man can go through. Now, it's Abraham giving his only son, whom he loves, Isaac, as a burnt offering. Now, we learned previously that God has chosen Abraham to start this brand new nation. And it's not just to, lift up Abraham, but it is to show how God is faithful throughout his entire history and how to bless all nations through Abraham. So that was the reason. Now, Abraham is about to get this test. Maybe perhaps for you guys, SATs, perhaps you think that is the most important test for your life, perhaps. But for Abraham and for many of us, this test that Abraham is about to take is the most important test. Now, it starts in verse 1, sometime later. So what happened in that sometime later? Starting Genesis chapter 12, God called Abraham. He says, "I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and all nations will be blessed through you." So that ever since God made a promise in Genesis chapter 12, a lot of things happened ever since then. At that time, Abraham was not a great man. He was not a great man of faith. He had a weak faith. He even almost sold his wife for money, right, to save his life. He was afraid to getting into Egypt. So even though those kind of things happened, God protected Abraham, and Abraham was growing little bit at a time. And Abraham even risked his life and took 318 men to rescue his nephew, Lot. Remember that story, right? So God is watching Abraham and helping him, protecting him to become a little bit more mature. Now in Genesis chapter 15, very important thing happened. God makes this important covenant once again with Abraham. And he asked Abraham to, kill these animals and split them in half. So put one half here and the other half here. In those days, that's how they made a covenant. That's how they made a promise. So if I was to make a promise with Pastor Charlie, we'll, sacrifice some animals and break them into 2 pieces, place them one on one side and the other one on the other, and both of us will walk in between to make this promise, whatever the promise may be. And what we are saying is, if either one of us break this promise, then may happen to either one of us, whoever breaks the promise, same thing that happens to these animals. They will be ripped apart. So that's how they made a covenant. Now, when God makes this covenant in Genesis chapter 15, He said, I will make you a great nation. You will be a source of blessing. And then God says, God is making this promise. So supposedly, God and who were supposed to walk between these two animals? God and Abraham were supposed to walk, but guess what? Only one party walks through this, and the other party was just watching. So God is the one who actually walked through the sacrifices that Abraham prepared. And why is that? Because God is saying that I make sure that I will be the one who fulfills this promise of making you a great nation. And if I don't keep that promise, God is saying that may it be to me. Same thing that happens to these animals. That's how certain and how firm God is making that promise to Abraham. That's what happened in chapter 15. Right after, however, Abraham and Sarah shows their weak flesh. I mean, they've been waiting ever since chapter 12. They've been waiting for about a decade, and they're getting old. Abraham was 75 when God first appeared in Genesis chapter 12. So it's been more than 10 years. Abraham and Sarah is not having any baby. They're getting older. So Sarah brought another idea. So Sarah had an Egyptian slave girl, Hagar. So Sarah says, through Hagar, maybe we can have a son. So that's what they agreed on. So Hagar became pregnant. So ever since then, what happens? Hagar was looking down on Sarah, even though Sarah was a master, because, hey, I'm a pregnant woman. You don't have a baby. So Sarah was now really upset and giving all this hard time to Hagar. So Hagar ran away because Sarah was giving her so, tough time, and hard time was just unbearable. So when Hagar ran away, what happened? The angel appeared, and what are you doing here? Well, my master is giving me such a hard time, I can't stand there. But the angel told Hagar to go back and be obedient to Sarah. So she did, and now she had a baby son, and they named him Ishmael. So Ishmael became, Abraham and Sarah thought that Ishmael is the promised son because they're not having any child. But then after years, when Abraham finally reached 99 years old, God appeared again. And He said, guess what? You are going to have a son. Ishmael is not the promised son. You and Sarah will have a child. And of course, Abraham and Sarah, by then, it was way too old. They were just laughing and couldn't believe. But nonetheless, God kept His promise. So when Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, Sarah became pregnant and had a son. And his name is Isaac. Now, when Isaac was a little bit older, now they were celebrating, but then Hagar and Ishmael was looking down on Isaac. When Sarah witnessed that, Sarah was very upset. Sarah wanted to just throw them out to the street, throw them out and kick them out of the house. And Abraham was kind of afraid because Ishmael is his son. Even though he may not be the promised son, he's his son nonetheless. So he was having a hard time. How can I just kick them out into the desert? That's too brutal. But God says, don't worry, I'll take care of Ishmael, and also just listen to Sarah and have them leave. And your promised son Isaac will be your promised son. And through him, I will make a great nation. So that's what he did. So Ishmael and Hagar was kicked out. Now, after all those things happened, and that's what happens in some time later in verse 1. Now, God appeared to Abraham, and He said He's going to test Abraham. Now, so I have a question for you. In If you can take out your sermon notes, I have the types of testing that God does to people. Well, whatever happens to people, there are a lot of three different things that I point out. There is a temptation, and there is a test, and there's neither one, right? Oh, well, we got the table. That's good. Well, what's the difference between temptation and testing? Well, the source is different. Who does the tempting? In the Bible, Satan and demons are the ones who are tempting you. And what is the purpose of tempting? Is to make you fall, to sin against God, to punish you, to keep you away from God. That's the temptation. What about testing? It says God tests his people. Sometimes God tested Joseph for his character, and then God tested Abraham here. So God does test people from time to time. What is the purpose of testing from God? Is it to punish you guys? No. The reason why God tests people is to bless, is to reward, is to approve. That's what the word test here means, to reward and to prove. But then here's the thing. Sometimes when tough things happen in our lives, it's neither temptation nor test. It's something that actually you choose to do. For example, like Sarah and Abraham. When Sarah says, hey, take my Egyptian slave girl and let's have a baby. Was that Satan tempting Abraham? No. Was it God testing Abraham? No. It was, whose idea was that? It was Sarah and Abraham's idea. So sometimes when tough things happen, and because Ishmael was born, Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, they all had a terrible time. It was very, very tough to raise. And this tension between these two ajumma was just overwhelming, right? So that's what happens. So sometimes it's neither temptation nor testing. But what happens when you are the one who's taking initiative and who's trying to fulfill God's promise? Sometimes we have to pay the consequences for those actions. So there are three different things. So then question is, how do you know? How can you find out whether something that is happening to you is a temptation from Satan? Or is it God testing me to reward me? Or is it something else? Is it just me who's doing it? How can you decide, or how can you determine, how can you discover, or how can you find out which one it is? Can you find out? If something terrible happens to you, can you find out which one it is? Not really. It's very, very tough. It's very hard and difficult for you to find out whether it's a temptation or testing. But one thing that we do know for sure, one thing that we have to focus on is found in Romans chapter 8. So let's look at that verse. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. It says this. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Now, it says, I'm so glad. Wait. Show that verse again. Romans 8:28. Can you show that on the screen? It says, I'm so glad it says God works for the good of those who love him. It says, we know that in how many things? All things, right? In all things, God works for the good. I'm glad that in all things. However, in order for all things to work for the good, there is a prerequisite. What is that? It is of those who love who? To those who love God and who have been called according to his purpose. So in order, whether it's something that is happening to your life, whether it's a temptation or testing or neither one of those two, It doesn't really matter. What really matters is as long as you love God, and as long as you are being obedient, as long as you are obedient to God's call, then everything is going to work for the good. Amen? So what you and I have to focus on is not trying to figure out, is it temptation from Satan? Is it testing from God? Instead of focusing on or trying to find out which one it is, we need to focus on loving God with all of our hearts and being obedient to His call in your life. Now, that's what happens in verse 1, that God is testing Abraham. Now, verse 2, He's calling Abraham. He says, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. And later on he says, sacrifice him. Now, that, you guys don't have son, do you? Or do you don't have a children? Yeah, okay. I mean, in general, you guys don't have children, right? Now, I as a father, this is just too much for me to take. If God is asking you to sacrifice your son, I don't want to worship that kind of God. What kind of God does that to people? So it was very, very difficult for me to hear. But when I dig in deep, He says, take your son. The Hebrew word take has a particle, na, next to it. And whenever there is a na particle in Hebrew word, it's very, very different. Now, that particle is in, the na is in more than 60 times in the book of Genesis alone. However, when God is speaking to people, that particle na is only 5 times in the entire Old Testament. And every single time, that 5 times when God is speaking to person, that na, that particle becomes please. So when God says, take your son, God is actually saying, take, please, your son. It's almost like God is begging Abraham. But then for us, God doesn't beg, God doesn't ask, God just commands. He is God, right? But the reason why He's using that particle is this, because all these 5 times when you look at the Bible, He understands that what God is asking these people to do is something that is far beyond people's understanding. It's so difficult decisions that they have to make. When those 5 incidences, when God first calls Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, there's a particle now in there. So I want you to leave your people, your land, your father's household. That is very difficult. So God once again puts that particle now. And also when God is asking Israelites to get out of Egypt, you know what God says? Ask your masters to give you gold and silver. Take that away from your master's house and go and leave the Egyptians, right? So God once again uses that. So every time when He uses that particle, God knows that what I'm commanding you is something that is hard for you to do. It's very difficult for you to understand. But nonetheless, it's my command. So when God says, take your son, God is saying, take, please. I know it's hard for you. And how does He know? Because what He's asking Abraham to do, God is going to do it exactly the same. Now, what did He say? Take your son, your only son. Why is Isaac the only son? What about Ishmael? Remember, Abraham kicked him out. And Ishmael is not the promised son that God promised him. Isaac is. So God is making sure that Isaac is the one that I'm asking you to sacrifice. Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. Now, this word love here This love is the very first time that is written in the entire Bible, the word love. In Genesis chapter 22, verse 2. That is the first time that God uses the word love. And it's very, very important when first word is appeared. Now, in Hebrew word love doesn't have a very significant meaning other than just love. But when this is translated into Greek, in Septuagint, you know how the Greek word for love has very different meanings? It's talking about what kind of love? It's talking about father loving his son, right? So they were supposed to use storge, which is the family love, like parents loving their children, children loving their parents. The Greek word is supposed to be storge. However, when they translated this Hebrew word love here into Septuagint, they used, guess what, love? They used the word agape. And why? Because that's exactly the love that God is going to show to the world. And Abraham is the foreshadow of what's about to come. That God is revealing. And that's the reason why God can use Abraham to bless all nations. And Abraham did love his son Isaac. Can you imagine the love that Abraham has for his son Isaac? It says, sometime later, after all these things that Abraham went through, having a baby through Hagar and all this tough time between Hagar and Sarah, and even up to the point where he had to kick his son out of his sight. And now he finally has his promised son. He's raising Isaac. That son, Isaac, one that you love, God is asking him to sacrifice. And that's what sacrifice means, church. I read it many years ago that sacrifice is giving something you love for someone you love even more. That's what sacrifice is. Sacrifice is not giving your leftovers. Sacrifice is not giving something that you don't care or you don't love. Is that the sacrifice that you guys bring to church or bring to God? Do you give it to God your leftover money? Or are you willing to give something that you love dearly because you love God more? And that sacrifice, that kind of sacrifice is the one that God made for you and me. God loved his only begotten Son. Yet because of his love for us, he gave up his only Son. And that's the test that Abraham is going through. Now, in verse 3, Abraham gets up early in the morning. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey, and he took with him 2 of his servants and went. I'm glad he got up early, because if he was waiting, he had to talk to Sarah. And Sarah might say, "Hey, husband, where are you going with our son Isaac?" And Abraham, "I'm going to sacrifice our son." Can you imagine? You think Sarah will just let him go? No way. So without saying any words to his wife, he goes onto this journey. It took him 3 days. Can you imagine what's going through his mind for those 3 days? Perhaps, am I dreaming right now? Is this a dream? Am I having a nightmare? God, if you are going to change your mind and let him live, please do it right now. So day 1 goes by, day 2, day 3 now. He finally reached the point. Now he's talking to his servants. Verse 5. Abraham said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then who's going to come back? We will come back to you." Well, Abraham is going to sacrifice his son, isn't he? He's obeying his command. So isn't he supposed to say, "I will come back"? But he says, "We will come back." Why did he say that? Well, we find that answer in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 19. It says, Abraham knew in his heart, in his mind, the reason why he did all this, according to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 19, it says, Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. And figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the death. So what Abraham believed in his heart, yeah, I will sacrifice my son, but God, who gave me that promise, will raise him from the dead. That's what was in his heart. So now he told the servants to stay here, and now he's walking with his son, Isaac. Only two of them is walking towards the mountain. So Abraham could be 110, 120 years old. He gave all this wood to his son Isaac to carry to make a sacrifice. Now, so Isaac and Abraham is going up. At that time, Isaac, we know, is not a baby. It's not a toddler. He's at least teenager, 15, 16 years old, or up to as old as 37. And we know that because Sarah died in age 127, according to chapter 23, so it's before Sarah passed away. So Isaac could not be any older than 37, and Isaac could not be toddler because he had to make a 3-day journey, and he can reason with his father and asking these kind of questions, and he can carry this wood that is to sacrifice, and he's going up the mountain with his father. So we know that he can be anywhere from 15 to 30 years old. Now that's very important because later on I'm going to tell you why it's so important. Now, nonetheless, Isaac and father is walking up to the mountain. And then Isaac is asking this question that hurts the father. He says in verse 7, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" It would be hard for you guys to imagine, but if you are the father and your son, whom you're about to sacrifice, is asking you, "Dad, we're going to make a sacrifice, aren't we? But where is the lamb?" And the father must have been so devastated. But Abraham gives very wise answer. He says, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offerings, my son." And the two of them went on together. And when they reached the place God had told him, Abraham built an altar there, arranged the wood on it, and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Now then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But of course, in verse 12, "Do not lay hands on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." So God says, "Stop." And he says, "Now I know that you fear God. Well, doesn't God know all things? Isn't God omniscient? He knows all these things. So didn't he know? He knew, right? He knew Abraham was going to do this, didn't he? But now, why does he say, now I know? The word know here, Hebrew word know, yada here, it means knowing through experience, by seeing. So what God is saying, now I've seen, now I experienced that you fear God. So now I know. That's what God is saying. So church, what about us? Maybe many of you say, God, I love you. I believe you. I trust you. But have you shown? Has God ever seen your faith? Has God ever experienced your love towards Him? Or was it just your mouth? Was it just your words? So does God know that you love Him? My prayer is that all of us, including myself, we will not just say to God, God, I love you. No. But we can actually show Him that we love Him. That is our prayer. Now, when I was meditating on chapter 22, it really hit me hard. That who has stronger faith? Abraham or Isaac? When it says sometime later, that time was necessary for God to prepare Abraham to become mature so he can pass this test. But at that time, I believe God was also preparing Isaac. Because once again, Isaac is how old? He's at least 15, 16, anywhere up to 30 years old. And Abraham is what? 115, 120 years old. So when Abraham, 120 years old, 할아버지 is bounding his son, a teenager or 20-year-old, Isaac can easily refuse. Dad, what are you doing? And he can easily get out. But Isaac, who's been loved dearly by his father, trusts his father Abraham enough so that he's even letting him take the knife. That's incredible faith. Many fathers say that I am more than willing to die for my children. But I don't know how many children trust their parents enough that they will give and trust their lives. When God revealed to Moses, God is introducing Himself as, I am the God of your forefathers. I am the God of your fathers. I am the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob. And the reason why God was able to do those things, the reason why the God of Abraham became the God of Isaac, and the God of Isaac became the God of Jacob, was because of this love. It's because Abraham showed Isaac how much Abraham trusts God and His word. How much did he trust Him? He trusted Him enough that he be willing to sacrifice his son, his only son, whom he loves. And Abraham loved his son Isaac. How much did he love him? He loved him. He poured his love towards his son so much that his son entrusts his life in the hands of his father. That was the love. That was the relationship. So my prayer once again for our church is that we can have that family. Well, I'm speaking to mostly children. So my prayer for you is that you can pray for your parents so that you can entrust your parents deeply, and your parents can fear God so the God of your parents can become your God, and your God can become your children's. And once again, God has revealed His love. Even if we fail, even if I don't become the father like Abraham, my God will love and take care of my children and the church. And He already have through Jesus Christ. So we can trust His promise. And let's do our best to show Him our love and our trust.